Esther was not born into royalty. She had no crown, no army, no treasures of her own. She was an orphan, raised in exile, living under the vast Persian Empire, the most powerful kingdom on earth. Yet her life carried a hidden purpose. Though unseen at the time, she was placed in history for a reason greater than herself. And one day she would be called to step into a moment that would change everything. This is not just the story of a queen, but the story of courage, faith, and how one woman's bravery saved her people. During the reign of King Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, the empire was filled with wealth and splendor. To display his greatness, Xerxes hosted a 6-month celebration for nobles, generals, and princes from every corner of his kingdom. When those days ended, he opened the palace gates to everyone in the capital, holding a 7-day banquet in the royal gardens where golden couches, marble pillars, and flowing wine set the scene for unmatched extravagance. Inside the palace, Queen Vashti held her own feast for the women. But on the final day of the celebration, when the king's heart was full of wine and pride, he commanded Vashti to appear before his guests wearing her crown, so they could marvel at her beauty. To everyone's shock, Vashti refused. She would not be treated as a display before a drunken crowd. The king's pride quickly turned into fury. Before all his nobles, the queen had openly defied him. His advisors warned that if her disobedience was tolerated, every wife across the empire would follow her example and undermine the authority of their husbands. Their solution was severe. Vashti must be removed, and a decree should be sent throughout the provinces declaring that every man is ruler in his own household. Xerxes agreed. Vashti was stripped of her crown and banished from his presence, and a royal order was carried across the empire in every language. The throne beside Xerxes was now empty, and the search for a new queen would soon begin. It was this search that would bring an unlikely young woman named Esther into the palace, and into the center of a divine plan. As time passed after Queen Vashti's removal, King Xerxes began to reflect on what had happened. Though his decree could not be undone, the memory of Vashti's beauty and defiance lingered. Seeing the king's mood, his advisors proposed a solution. Gather the most beautiful young women from every province of the empire, prepare them for the king, and let him choose a new queen. Xerxes agreed, and messengers were sent across all 127 provinces to search for candidates. Among those taken to the palace was a young Jewish woman named Hadassah, known by her Persian name, Esther. She was an orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai, who loved her as his own daughter. Mordecai had taught her to remain faithful to God and to keep her identity hidden in this foreign land. When Esther arrived at the palace, she was placed under the care of Haggai, the official in charge of the women. Unlike the others, she did not demand luxuries or seek attention. Instead, her humility and grace won the admiration of everyone around her, especially Haggai. He gave her the best care and ensured she was prepared for the day she would meet the king. For 12 months, Esther went through the customs of beauty treatments required for every woman who entered the palace. When her turn finally came to stand before King Xerxes, she did not rely on ornaments or excess, but carried herself with quiet dignity. The moment the king saw her, he was captivated. Xerxes loved Esther more than any other woman, and he placed the royal crown on her head, making her queen in Vashti's place. To honor her, he declared a royal banquet and proclaimed a holiday throughout the empire. Yet even as she took her place beside the king, no one knew Esther's secret, that she was a Jew chosen not for privilege, but for a divine purpose that was only just beginning. While Esther settled into life within the palace, her cousin Mordecai remained close by, spending his days at the king's gate where officials and servants gathered. He was not a nobleman, but his presence there was no accident. God had placed him exactly where he needed to be. One day, as Mordecai sat at his usual spot, he overheard 2 of the king's guards, Bigthan and Teresh, speaking in hushed tones. Their voices were filled with anger and resentment as they plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. Mordecai knew this was treason, and he did not hesitate. He quickly sent word to Queen Esther, who now had direct access to the king. Esther reported the plot to Xerxes, making sure he knew the warning came from Mordecai. An investigation was carried out and the truth was revealed. The two men were guilty. By Persian law, their punishment was swift and brutal. They were executed for their betrayal. The king's life was spared, and the event was recorded in the Royal Chronicles, the official book of the empire. Yet strangely, Mordecai received no recognition, no reward, not even a word of thanks. His name was written in the records, but his act of loyalty went unnoticed. For now, because the day would come when that forgotten entry would change everything. Not long after, King Xerxes elevated a man named Haman, an Agagite, to the highest position among his officials. All throughout the empire, people were commanded to bow down before him as a sign of respect. Everyone obeyed except Mordecai. Day after day, Mordecai refused to bow. Haman's pride could not bear such defiance. When he discovered that Mordecai was a Jew, his anger grew into hatred. It was not enough for him to punish one man. He wanted to wipe out an entire people. He began plotting the destruction of every Jew in the empire. To decide the timing, Haman cast lots, called Purim, and the day was set. Then with cunning words he approached King Xerxes. "There is a group of people scattered across your provinces," he said. "They follow their own laws different from yours, and they refuse to obey your decrees. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Allow me to deal with them." Deceived by Haman's words, Xerxes agreed. He removed the signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, granting him authority to carry out his plan. Letters sealed with the king's ring were sent to every province, declaring that on the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew, young and old, men and women, was to be killed, and their possessions taken as plunder. As the messengers spread the decree, confusion filled the capital. Grief and fear swept through the Jewish community. Mourning broke out in every province as God's people faced certain destruction. When Mordecai learned of the decree, his heart broke. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and wept openly in the streets of Susa. Across the empire, Jews fasted, mourned, and cried out. Knowing their destruction had been sealed, news of Mordecai's mourning reached Esther inside the palace. Concerned, she sent a servant to ask what had happened. Through the messenger, Mordecai explained the decree and urged Esther to go before the king and beg for mercy on behalf of her people. But Esther hesitated. The law of Persia was clear. No one could approach the king uninvited. To do so was to risk death, unless the king extended his golden scepter. Esther admitted she had not been summoned for 30 days. Fear weighed heavily on her. Mordecai's reply was firm and full of conviction. "Do not think that because you are in the palace you will escape this fate. If you remain silent, help will arise for the Jews from somewhere else, but you and your family will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have come to the throne for just such a time as this." Those words struck Esther's heart. Her fear began to turn into faith. She sent her answer back. "Go, gather all the Jews in Susa. Fast for me for 3 days and nights. I and my maids will do the same. When it is finished, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." With that decision, Esther's destiny moved into motion. She would risk everything, her crown, her comfort, even her life, for the sake of her people. On the 3rd day of the fast, Esther dressed in her royal robes and made her way to the inner court of the palace. Every step carried the weight of life and death. If the king turned against her, her life would end in that moment. From his throne, Xerxes saw her standing in the doorway. Time seemed to hang in the air. Then slowly, he reached out his hand and extended the golden scepter. Esther approached and touched its tip, her life spared by the king's favor. "What is it, Queen Esther?" Xerxes asked warmly. "What is your request?" "Even up to half my kingdom it will be granted." Esther chose her words carefully. Instead of making her plea immediately, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. Curious and intrigued, the king accepted, and Haman was thrilled at being included. At the banquet, Xerxes again asked Esther, "What is your request?" "Whatever you ask will be granted." Yet Esther held back. She invited the king and Haman to another banquet the following day, promising that then she would reveal her true request. That night, however, the king could not sleep. Restless, he ordered the royal chronicles to be read aloud to him. As the records were opened, a long-forgotten entry was uncovered. the story of how Mordecai had once revealed a plot to assassinate the king. Xerxes was stunned. His life had been saved, yet no reward had ever been given to Mordecai. "Has anything been done to honor this man?" he asked. His servants replied, "Nothing has been done." The king's mind began to turn, and the pieces of the story were quietly shifting into place. Early the next morning, Haman hurried to the palace, eager to request the king's permission to hang Mordecai on a gallows he had already built. But before he could speak, Xerxes called him in with a question. "Haman, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman's heart swelled with pride. Surely the king meant him. Imagining the glory he deserved, he answered boldly, "Let him be dressed in the king's royal robes, the very garments the king has worn. Place a crown upon his head and seat him on the king's own horse. Let one of the noblest officials lead him through the city, proclaiming, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" The king smiled. "Excellent, go at once. Do everything you have said. For Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate, leave nothing undone." The color drained from Haman's face. His pride shattered and his heart pounded in dread. Yet he had no choice. He dressed Mordecai in royal robes, placed him on the king's horse, and walked before him through the streets of Susa, shouting the very words he had hoped would be proclaimed for himself. Humiliated and broken, Haman returned home and told his wife and friends what had happened. They warned him with grim faces. "If Mordecai is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely fall." Even as they spoke, messengers arrived to summon Haman to Esther's second banquet, a meal that would seal his fate. At the second banquet, King Xerxes and Haman sat once more at Esther's table. The air was heavy with anticipation as the king looked into Esther's eyes. "My queen," he said, "what is your request? Speak, and it will be granted even if it is half the kingdom." This time, Esther did not remain silent. Gathering her courage, she spoke with passion. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my request. And spare my people, this is my petition. For we have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would have remained silent. But this threat is too great to ignore." Xerxes' expression hardened in shock and anger. "Who is the man who dares to do such a thing?" he demanded. Esther pointed directly at her enemy. "The adversary and enemy is this wicked man, Haman." Haman's face went pale. Terror gripped him as the king rose in fury and stormed out into the palace garden. Desperate, Haman fell at Esther's couch, begging for his life. At that very moment, Xerxes returned and saw him clinging to the queen. "Will he even assault the queen while I am in my own house?" The king roared. Guards rushed forward, covering Haman's head. One of the attendants spoke. "There is a gallows outside, 75 feet high, that Haman built for Mordecai. Hang him on it," the king commanded. And so, the gallows Haman had built for Mordecai became the very place of his own death. Justice was swift, and the enemy of the Jews was destroyed. With Haman gone, King Xerxes gave his estate to Queen Esther, and she appointed Mordecai to oversee it. The king also removed his signet ring, the very one he had once given to Haman, and placed it on Mordecai's hand, granting him royal authority. But the danger was not yet over. The original decree, sealed with the king's ring, could not be revoked. Across the empire, the 13th day of the 12th month still stood as the day when the Jews were to be destroyed. Esther again approached the king, this time not for her own life but for the lives of her people. Falling before him, she pleaded, "How can I endure to see disaster fall upon my people? How can I watch the destruction of my family?" Xerxes listened and gave his consent for a new decree. Mordecai quickly summoned the royal scribes and dictated a command in the king's name. The Jews in every city were granted the right to assemble, defend themselves, and destroy anyone who attacked them. The order was sealed with the king's ring and sent out to all 127 provinces in every language. When the decree spread, despair turned to hope. The Jews prepared themselves, standing united and courageous. On the appointed day, their enemies gathered to strike, but the Jews fought back with strength and determination. With the king's support and Mordecai's new authority, they prevailed. In the capital city of Susa, 500 attackers fell on the first day, including Haman's 10 sons, who were later hanged at Esther's request. On the second day, 300 more enemies were defeated. Across the empire, 75,000 were struck down. Yet the Jews did not take plunder. Their battle was not for greed, but for survival. What was meant to be a day of sorrow turned into a day of triumph. Where there had been mourning, there was now joy and celebration. When the battles ended, the people finally rested. What began as a day marked for destruction had become a day of deliverance. Mourning had turned into laughter, grief into rejoicing. To remember this great reversal, the Jews established a yearly festival called Purim, named after the lots Haman had cast to determine the day of their destruction. But instead of death, that day became a symbol of life and victory. Every year, on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, the people would feast and celebrate, send gifts to one another, and give generously to the poor. Mordecai, once a simple man sitting at the king's gate, was now honored throughout the empire. Clothed in royal blue and white, crowned with dignity, he stood second only to King Xerxes. But what made him great was not his title, it was his heart. He worked for the good of his people and spoke peace and truth to all. And though the name of God is never mentioned in the entire story of Esther, his presence is unmistakable. In every twist of fate, every moment of risk, and every act of courage, his guiding hand was at work. What was intended for destruction, he turned into salvation. The story of Esther reminds us that even when God seems silent, he is never absent. Even when the odds are against us, he is already moving pieces into place. And perhaps just as Esther was, each of us is placed where we are for a purpose, for such a time as this.